children, teenagers, and the label of defective. When people imagine the dark history of British asylums, they often picture adults. They imagine old men wandering endless corridors, women in white gowns staring through barred windows, or the forgotten elderly fading away behind locked doors. But one of the most disturbing truths about Britain's institutional past is this: children were there too. Not just a handful. Not just in rare or extreme cases. But in significant numbers. Across decades, folded into a system that often saw difference, dependency, vulnerability, and poverty not as conditions to understand, but as problems to remove from view. Inside the history of the British asylum system lies a quieter, colder story, one that is sometimes overshadowed by the broader horrors of adult confinement. It is the story of children who were labeled before they were understood. Children who were classified before they were heard. Children whose futures were narrowed, often permanently, by words stamped onto records in hard black ink by strangers in authority. Words like idiot. Words like imbecile. Words like feeble-minded. Words that were not just insults, but official categories. Administrative categories. Medical categories. Legal categories. Categories that shaped where a child could live, whether they could go to school, whether they would be separated from family. Whether they would be trained, controlled, hidden away, or forgotten entirely. To modern ears, these terms sound openly cruel. And they were. But what makes them even more chilling is that for decades, they were spoken with the cold confidence of science, the confidence of bureaucracy, the confidence of institutions convinced they were acting rationally, efficiently, even humanely. Behind those labels were real children. Children who could not speak in ways adults expected. Children who learned slowly. Children who had seizures. Children who struggled to regulate emotion. Children born into poverty. Children considered unruly, difficult, strange, withdrawn, overactive, uncontrollable, or simply inconvenient. Some had developmental disabilities. Some had neurological conditions. Some had hearing or communication impairments. Some had suffered trauma. Some had been neglected. Some were orphaned. Some had no stable home to return to. And some may not have had any profound condition at all beyond being poor, unsupported, misunderstood, and born into a society with little patience for difference. For many of these children, institutional life did not begin with healing. It began with classification, with observation, with judgment, with the slow transformation of a child into a case. And once that happened, it could become frighteningly difficult to reverse. Because a child placed inside an institution was no longer just a son or daughter, no longer just a frightened boy or girl, no longer just a young person struggling in a hard world. They became part of a system. A system of files, examinations, routines, reports, and decisions made by people who believed they could define a human life from the outside. And perhaps that is one of the darkest things about this chapter of British asylum history. Not only that children suffered, but that many were made to suffer under the claim that this was necessary, orderly, beneficial, or even kind. To understand how this happened, we have to step into a time when childhood itself was seen very differently. Because in the Britain of the 19th and early 20th centuries, the modern language of child psychology, neurodiversity, developmental support, trauma-informed care, and inclusive education simply did not exist in the way we know it now. There was no broad public understanding of autism. No compassionate framework for learning disabilities. No modern approach to epilepsy free from stigma and fear. No nuanced recognition of how abuse, deprivation, malnutrition, grief, and instability could shape a child's behavior. Instead, many children who did not fit expectations were viewed through crude moral and medical lenses. If a child could not learn quickly, something was wrong. If a child behaved unpredictably, something was wrong. If a child was difficult to manage, something was wrong. If a child had seizures, or strange movements, or periods of silence, or extreme distress, or developmental delay, or trouble communicating, or intense emotional reactions, or inability to conform to school discipline or domestic expectations, something was wrong. And wrong in that world often did not lead toward understanding. It led toward sorting, separating, naming, containing. There is something especially tragic about the confinement of children because childhood is, by its nature, unfinished. A child is becoming. A child is changing constantly. A child who seems delayed at 6 may flourish at 10. A child who appears unreachable in one environment may open up in another. A child marked by grief or instability may recover with safety, care, patience, and love. But institutions often worked in the opposite direction. They fixed identity early. They froze possibility. They turned temporary struggle into permanent category. Once a child was judged defective by the language of the age, the future could begin to close around them like a locked door. And so the first question we have to ask is this: how did children end up in these places at all? The answer is not simple. There was no single path. No one reason. No one type of child. Some entered through the machinery of poverty. Some through medicine. Some through law. Some through family desperation. Some through school systems unable or unwilling to cope. Some through the death or collapse of the home itself. For poor families, the burden could be overwhelming. Imagine a household already on the edge of survival. Too many mouths to feed. Irregular work. A sick parent. A crowded home. Little access to doctors. No welfare system capable of offering meaningful long-term support. And within that home, a child who needs constant supervision. A child with seizures. A child who cannot be left alone. A child who struggles to communicate. A child who is physically growing stronger but is still dependent. A child whose behavior is unpredictable or self-harming. A child who keeps other family members awake night after night. In another era, with community support, respite care, medical treatment, educational assistance, and social understanding, such a child might remain part of family life. But in that world, many families had almost nothing. No trained support. No therapeutic services. No specialized schooling nearby. No financial help worth the name. And so what looked from the outside like abandonment could sometimes grow from desperation. Not indifference, but exhaustion. Not lack of love, but collapse. That does not make the outcome any less tragic. But it reminds us that this story is not only about cruel institutions. It is also about a society that left families with so few humane options that institutional separation began to seem like the only path left. Then there were children orphaned or semi-orphaned. Children whose parents had died, disappeared, become ill, entered the workhouse, or were otherwise unable to care for them. Some moved through a chain of institutions from the very beginning of life. The workhouse nursery. The industrial school. The infirmary. The special school. The asylum. The colony. The mental deficiency institution. A child could be passed from one authority to another, each step shrinking their freedom a little more, until institutional life became not an interruption, but the whole structure of existence. And then there were children brought in because of epilepsy. This is one of the most revealing and heartbreaking threads in the history of confinement. For much of British history, epilepsy carried tremendous fear and stigma. Seizures were poorly understood, frightening to witness, and often associated with madness, danger, degeneration, or defect. A child with epilepsy might be seen not simply as medically unwell, but as socially unmanageable. If seizures happened in school, in church, in public, or at home, they could trigger panic and shame. Families might be pitted, blamed, or quietly pressured to seek institutional care. And because epilepsy often overlapped in public imagination with mental disorder, many epileptic children found themselves drawn into systems that were not designed primarily for their flourishing, but for their control. The same was true for children with learning disabilities. Some needed extra teaching, more time, adapted methods, or supportive environments. But instead of receiving tailored education, many were absorbed into crude systems of ranking and segregation. The question was often not, what does this child need to thrive? The question was, what category does this child belong in? Can they be managed in ordinary school? Can they be made useful? Are they educable? Are they trainable? Are they a burden? Are they a danger? Are they fit for home life? It is hard to overstate how much damage those questions could do. Because they were not neutral. They were loaded with assumptions about productivity, normality, class, and worth. A child who did not meet the expected standard of speech, behavior, learning, or self-control risked being judged not as a child in need of support, but as evidence of failure, defect, and social problem. And once official machinery began to move, it could become relentless. Doctors examined. School authorities reported. Guardians decided. Magistrates approved. Inspectors classified. Paperwork accumulated. And in that paperwork, children were translated into the sterile language of diagnosis and administration. Perhaps this is the moment to pause over those terrible historical terms. Idiot. Imbecile. Feeble-minded. These were not merely random insults used carelessly in conversation, although they were certainly demeaning. They also became formal categories in medicine, education, and law. They were used to rank supposed levels of mental capacity, to separate those deemed incapable of education from those considered partially trainable, to justify different forms of institutional placement, to decide who might be supervised, detained, schooled, worked, restricted, or isolated. The violence of this language was not only in its cruelty. It was in its power. A cruel word spoken in anger wounds. A cruel word spoken by an institution can organize an entire life. Once written into records, these labels followed children like shadows. They could shape where they slept, what they were taught, whether they were expected to improve, whether they could return home, whether they would be seen as capable of adulthood, marriage, work, parenthood, or independent life. The label became prophecy. And institutions are very good at making their prophecies come true. Because when a child is told implicitly or explicitly that they are limited, defective, permanently inferior, when they are denied stimulation, denied challenge, denied affection, denied education, denied freedom, then the institution itself helps produce the very passivity and dependency it claims to observe. This is one of the cruelest loops in the whole history of institutional care. Children were placed in restrictive environments because they were judged deficient. Then those environments stunted growth. And the resulting stagnation was taken as proof that the original judgment had been correct. A child denied ordinary life may struggle to develop ordinary confidence. A child denied family warmth may appear emotionally flat. A child denied meaningful education may fail educational tests. A child denied decision-making may become dependent. And the institution, looking at the result of its own deprivation, could say, "You see? This child was never fit for freedom." That is the cold machinery of containment. And it is especially devastating when applied to the young. What was daily life like for these children once inside institutional care? That depended on the time, the place, the type of institution, and the people running it. Some institutions claim to offer training, discipline, moral guidance, and structured education. And in some cases, children may indeed have experienced moments of kindness from individual staff members, teachers, nurses, or attendants trying to do good within a broken system. It is important not to flatten all history into a single tone. Not every ward was a dungeon. Not every staff member was cruel. Not every institution was identical. But the broader structure was still deeply damaging. because even under comparatively better conditions, institutional childhood often meant the loss of ordinary life. The loss of spontaneous play. The loss of home rhythms. The loss of privacy. The loss of attachment. The loss of being known not as a category, but as yourself. Imagine waking each day not in a family home, but in a dormitory. Rows of beds. Thin blankets. Shared air. Shared smells. The sounds of coughing, muttering, crying, shuffling, bed frames scraping. Staff moving through the room not as parents, but as supervisors. There might be early rising bells. Washing in cold or hurried conditions. Lined-up inspections. Institutional clothing. Meals served in bulk. Rules that applied to everyone whether or not they made sense for an individual child. The whole shape of the day determined from above. For a child, this kind of world could be profoundly disorienting. Children need routine, yes. But they also need affection, responsiveness, choice, safety, play, emotional mirroring, and the intimate sense that they matter personally. Institutional routine often provided order without nurture. Structure without intimacy. Supervision without belonging. And there is a vast difference between being cared for and being managed. In some places, children were grouped according to age, sex, diagnosis, or supposed level of ability. But grouping did not necessarily mean suitable care. Understaffing was a persistent problem. Resources were often limited. Individual attention could vanish inside overcrowded systems. A child who was frightened, overstimulated, grieving, or confused might simply be seen as troublesome. A child's meltdown might be treated as disorder. A child's silence might be treated as vacancy. A child's distress might be ignored because distress was everywhere. And that may be one of the most haunting realities of all. When suffering becomes ordinary inside an institution, people stop hearing it properly. A child crying at night may not trigger alarm if there are always children crying at night. A withdrawn teenager may disappear into the background if emotional absence is common. A seizure, a panic response, a repetitive movement, a refusal to eat, a self-soothing habit, a look of terror, all of it can become just another feature of the ward. Institutional life can normalize the intolerable. Then there was education. On paper, many institutions claimed to teach, to train, to improve, to equip children for some degree of usefulness and order. And again, there were cases where basic literacy, discipline, or practical skills may have been offered. But we have to ask a harder question. Education for what? Was it education aimed at broadening a child's world? At discovering talent? At encouraging curiosity? At opening paths to a freer future? Or was it education in the narrowest sense, just enough discipline, obedience, and routine to make a child easier to manage, more productive, less disruptive? Too often, the answer leaned toward the latter. Expectations were low. Curricula could be minimal. Children deemed severely defective might receive almost no meaningful education at all. The assumption that they could not learn became self-fulfilling. Why invest deeply in a child the system has already decided is limited? Why imagine possibility when the category has already defined the outcome? So education, where it existed, could become another form of sorting. Another mechanism that reinforced the child's assigned place in the hierarchy of worth. Those judged more capable might be taught simple reading, writing, counting, domestic skills, craft work, farm tasks, or disciplined habits. Those judged less capable might be offered little beyond containment and routine. And for many, the transition from schooling to labor happened quickly. Because institutions were never just educational spaces. They were economies. Self-sustaining systems. And children, especially as they entered adolescence, could become workers within that system. Boys might be sent to gardens, farms, workshops, grounds maintenance, or basic manual tasks. Girls might be pulled into laundry work, sewing, cleaning, kitchen duty, or domestic labor. Again, This might be justified as training, preparation for useful life, constructive occupation. But the line between training and exploitation could be very thin. An institution that depends on the labor of those confined within it has a powerful incentive to frame labor as therapeutic necessity. And teenagers, old enough to work, young enough to be controlled, were especially vulnerable to this logic. Imagine growing up behind walls, being told by authority figures what you are, what you can become, what you will never be. Imagine adolescence, that fragile time when identity forms, unfolding not through freedom, experimentation, friendships, and chosen aspirations, but through surveillance, regimentation, and institutional labels. Who do you become under those conditions? How do you imagine a future if every structure around you implies that your future is already decided? For some children and teenagers, the institution was not a temporary detour. It became destiny. A child admitted young might pass through years of institutional life until the transition into adulthood happened almost invisibly. No dramatic release. No sudden independence. No first real step into the outside world. Just a gradual transfer from child ward to adult ward, from schoolroom to labor, from supervision to deeper confinement. The institution raising the very adults it would continue to contain. That is one of the most devastating long-term consequences of childhood confinement. A child can adapt to almost anything. Humans are tragically good at adaptation. A child can adapt to regimented bells, to dormitory sleep, to monitored behavior, to emotional distance, to narrow expectations, to dependence, to not being chosen, to not being touched kindly enough, to not being trusted, to not being free. But adaptation is not the same as flourishing. And when adaptation to confinement becomes the central skill of childhood, freedom itself can start to feel alien. This created a terrible paradox. The longer a child remained inside, the less prepared they might be for life outside. And the less prepared they seemed, the more authorities could argue they needed continued care. The institution thus created the dependency it used to justify its own necessity. This is how the confinement of children became self-perpetuating. Not always through overt brutality. Sometimes through something quieter and equally destructive. The slow erosion of possibility. Of course, we also have to acknowledge the emotional reality of family separation. For a child, removal from home, even a difficult home, can wound deeply. Some children may have felt abandoned, though their families were simply overwhelmed. Some may have waited for visits that rarely came. Some may have seen parents only under formal conditions, if at all. Some may have received letters they could not read, or were not allowed to keep, or that arrived too late to mean much. Some may have forgotten faces over time. And some families, burdened by poverty, distance, shame, or official discouragement, may have drifted away not because they stopped caring, but because the system made continued connection painfully hard. That loss matters. Because childhood identity is built through relationship. Who tells you who you are? Who remembers your earliest habits, your fears, your favorite toy, the song that calms you, the way you laugh, the foods you hate, the stories you love, the nicknames only family uses? Institutions can record a child's measurements, symptoms, incidents, seizures, behaviors, and compliance. But that is not the same as knowing a child. To be known only through institutional records is a form of disappearance. And many children suffered exactly that kind of disappearance. They became paperwork. Case notes. Categories. Numbers in annual reports. Evidence of burden. Evidence of need. Evidence of system capacity. Anything but full human beings in the richness of childhood. There is another dark layer to all of this, and that is the influence of broader ideas about national efficiency, heredity, and social control. As Britain moved into the late 19th and early 20th centuries, anxieties about degeneration, dependency, and the future of the population became increasingly powerful. People labeled feeble-minded were not always feared only as individuals in need of care. They were also discussed as social threats. Threats to order. Threats to morality. Threats to the strength of the nation. Threats to the future. Children carrying these labels therefore became entangled in something larger than medicine. They became part of a political and social imagination obsessed with classification, prevention, and control. The child was no longer just a child. The child was treated as a potential future problem. A future pauper. A future criminal. A future burden. A future parent of more defective children. And once society starts imagining children primarily as future threats instead of vulnerable human beings, the moral ground becomes very dangerous indeed. Segregation becomes easier to justify. Long-term detention becomes easier to defend. Freedom becomes something withheld for the supposed good of society. This is why the language of bureaucracy matters so much in this history. It allowed cruelty to present itself as order. Fear to present itself as planning. Exclusion to present itself as care. And children, with so little power to resist, were among the easiest for the system to absorb. Even when institutional conditions improved in certain places over time, even when reforms were introduced, even when staff genuinely believed they were helping, the deeper problem remained. The system was still built around categories that diminished personhood. It was still built around segregation. It was still built around assumptions that some lives should unfold behind walls. And for those who entered as children, the emotional cost could echo for decades. Some left institutions carrying dependence that had been intensified by confinement. Some left with minimal education. Some left with no experience of ordinary social life. Some left with trauma. Some left elderly, after entire youth and adulthood had been consumed inside. And some never left at all. Their childhood disappeared into the institution so completely that the outside world became a rumor, then a memory, then nothing. When we look back now, there is a temptation to imagine that the cruelty was obvious to everyone at the time. But history is more unsettling than that. Much of this happened not through open declarations of evil, but through ordinary systems doing what they had been designed to do. Forms were filled. Committees met. Children were assessed. Beds were allocated. Budgets were balanced. Rules were followed. Routine continued. And all the while, childhoods were being quietly narrowed behind official doors. That is what makes this history so disturbing. It was not always theatrical. It was administrative. Not always dramatic. Often procedural. And some of the deepest harm human beings can inflict on one another comes not with shouting, but with paperwork. With categories. With signatures. With the calm voice of authority saying, "This child belongs here." Today, many of the words once used officially are recognized for what they were: dehumanizing, reductive, and cruel. Modern disability rights movements, child protection standards, inclusive education, and mental health awareness have challenged many of the assumptions that once drove long-term confinement. But the legacy remains. Not only in archives, not only in abandoned wards, not only in old laws and faded case files, but in the lives shaped by those systems, and in the warning they leave behind. Because the central moral question of this chapter is still painfully relevant. What does a society do with children who do not fit its preferred model of normality? Does it listen? Does it adapt? Does it support families? Does it provide care without erasing personhood? Does it make room for vulnerability and difference? Or does it classify quickly, separate efficiently, and hide the problem from view? The history of children in British institutional care shows us what happens when classification outruns compassion. When management replaces relationship. When people mistake containment for care. And when children, who should have been met with patience and possibility, are instead met with labels heavy enough to crush an entire life. So when we walk mentally through the history of the British asylum, when we picture those long corridors and shuttered wards and locked gates, we should remember that among the adults were children. Children waking in dormitories far from home. Children learning early that authority could rename them. Children growing up under watch. Children becoming adults inside systems that had claimed, from the start, to know exactly what they were worth. That is the horror here. Not only the suffering, but the theft of becoming. The theft of futures before they had fully begun. And in the next part, we move deeper into one of the most feared dimensions of asylum history. The world of treatment. The methods used in the name of cure, control, discipline, and medical progress. Because behind the walls of Britain's institutions, the body itself became a battleground. And for many patients, young and old alike, what was called treatment could feel frighteningly close to punishment. Treatments that terrified patients. If the asylum was meant to be a place of healing, then one of the hardest questions we have to ask is this: why did so many patients fear treatment itself? Why, in so many testimonies, memoirs, investigations, and retrospective accounts, does the very word treatment seem to carry not comfort, but dread? Why do so many old psychiatric procedures still echo in the public imagination not as symbols of relief, but as symbols of power, helplessness, coercion, and terror? Part of the answer lies in a fundamental contradiction at the heart of institutional psychiatry in Britain and beyond. A hospital is supposed to care for the suffering. A doctor is supposed to relieve distress. A treatment is supposed to help. But inside overcrowded institutions, where control and cure were often tangled together, that boundary could become frighteningly blurred. Because in practice, treatment did not always mean restoring a person's inner world. Sometimes it meant subduing their outer behavior. Sometimes it meant making them quieter. Still, more manageable. Less disruptive to the ward. Less exhausting to staff. Less visibly distressed. Less resistant. And that raises an uncomfortable possibility at the heart of asylum history. What if some of the things called treatment were judged successful not because they restored a patient's humanity, but because they made suffering easier for the institution to contain? That is the shadow hanging over this chapter. Because British asylums, like many psychiatric institutions of the past, were not frozen in one era or one method. Over time, they changed. Old forms of restraint gave way, at least in part, to new medical technologies. Crude confinement evolved into chemical sedation. Physical coercion was sometimes replaced by procedures carried out under the authority of science. Public language shifted from discipline to therapy, from restraint to intervention, from custody to treatment. But a change in language does not always mean a change in experience. For the person inside the ward, what mattered was not the theory written in textbooks, but the reality of what was done to their body. And for many patients, that reality was frightening. To understand why, we have to begin with some of the oldest forms of institutional control. Not with machines humming in treatment rooms. Not with white-coated specialists. But with the simplest and most brutal question any institution faces when confronted with distress. What do you do with a person who will not be still? In the early history of asylums, one answer was restraint. Physical restraint. Mechanical restraint. The direct immobilizing of the body. There is something immediately chilling about this because it strips the language of care down to its most naked form of power. A distressed patient cries out, resists, lashes out, panics, paces, claws, throws, strikes, or attempts escape. And the institution responds not by asking only what pain is driving this behavior, but by asking how that behavior can be stopped. How movement can be limited. How disruption can be suppressed. How risk can be contained. So enters the world of straps, locked garments, restraining devices, and seclusion. Perhaps the most infamous symbol is the straitjacket. Even today, the image remains powerful, a human being wrapped into confinement, arms bound tight across the body, movement reduced, autonomy erased. The straitjacket has become one of the defining visual symbols of psychiatric horror, and not by accident. Because whatever theoretical justifications were offered at the time, safety, prevention of self-harm, protection of others, temporary control during violent episodes. The lived experience could be one of fear, humiliation, rage, and suffocating helplessness. Imagine already being in distress. Already confused. Already terrified. Perhaps hearing voices. Perhaps overwhelmed by grief, panic, mania, hallucination, exhaustion, or trauma. And then, rather than being soothed, you are physically overpowered. Hands gripping your limbs. Your body forced into a garment designed not to comfort, but to deny movement. The chest tight. The arms trapped. The struggle itself becoming more evidence of danger. And the more you resist, the more necessary the restraint appears to those applying it. This is one of the darkest feedback loops in the history of psychiatric control. Resistance can become proof. Fear can become proof. Panic can become proof. The patient's horror at being restrained is reinterpreted as confirmation that restraint was needed. And once this logic takes hold, the patient's inner reality matters less and less. What matters is the visible body. Is it still? Is it compliant? Is it contained? That is what the institution measures. And so restraint, even when justified as protection, could slide into punishment. Not always officially. Not always openly. But functionally. A patient who was difficult might be more likely to be restrained. A patient who shouted, refused orders, fought attendance, or would not submit to routine might experience control in harsher forms. A patient who was simply too distressed for the institution to manage gently might be subdued in the name of order. And here we begin to see the core question that haunts this entire chapter. Was the goal to heal suffering, or to stop the visible inconvenience of suffering? Alongside garments like the straitjacket came other forms of mechanical restraint and bodily control. Belts. Straps. Restraining chairs in some settings. Methods of confining a person to bed or room. Not every institution used the same methods in the same way, and not every era treated restraint identically. There were reform movements, criticisms, and attempts to reduce overt mechanical coercion. Some British psychiatric reformers prided themselves on non-restraint approaches in theory. That matters, because the history is not one flat line of uninterrupted brutality. But theory and practice are often different things. Even where formal non-restraint was celebrated, patients could still be handled forcibly, isolated, chemically subdued, or otherwise controlled. An institution can abolish one visible symbol of coercion while preserving the deeper logic of coercion beneath another name. And that brings us to seclusion. If restraint binds the body, seclusion removes the person. A locked room. Sometimes bare, sometimes sparse, sometimes cold, sometimes dim. A place where a patient could be shut away from others, away from stimulation, away from the ward. Again, the official reasoning might sound measured. Protection. Calm. Reduction of agitation. Time to settle. Safety. But for the patient, seclusion could be profoundly frightening. Especially if they did not understand why it was happening. Especially if they were already paranoid. Especially if isolation intensified hallucinations or despair. Especially if the room itself felt less like a place of rest and more like a cell. And that is a word that keeps returning whenever we study the darker side of asylum medicine. Cell. Because however medicalized the surroundings became, many experiences inside asylums retained the emotional structure of imprisonment. Locked doors. Controlled movement. Punishment-like consequences. Observation without consent. Isolation without comfort. And if a patient already feared they were being persecuted, watched, trapped, or harmed, then seclusion could deepen rather than ease their terror. Imagine the sounds disappearing behind the closed door. The corridor outside going muffled. The walls close. The mind turning inward. For some, that might indeed reduce overstimulation. But for others, it could become a chamber where panic magnified itself. Where time stretched. Where there was nothing to do but wait. Where the institution's message became unmistakably physical. You have been removed. You are a problem to be separated. You will return when you are quiet enough. That word again, quiet. Quietness became one of the most dangerous markers of supposed improvement in psychiatric history. Not because calm is bad. Not because relief is bad. But because institutions under pressure can mistake silence for wellness. A person can be silent because they are healed. But they can also be silent because they are terrified, drugged, exhausted, broken, or have learned that speaking only worsens what is done to them. The ward often cannot tell the difference. Or does not care to. As psychiatry evolved, the language of treatment became increasingly medical. By the late 19th and especially the 20th century, there was growing emphasis on scientific intervention, biological explanation, and somatic treatment, in other words, treatment directed at the body in hopes of changing the mind. This shift matters because it transformed the appearance of psychiatric authority. The old attendant forcing a patient into confinement began to share space with the physician prescribing a sedative, ordering a procedure, or endorsing a new therapy backed by medical reasoning. To the public, this could look like progress. And in some respects, parts of it were. Not every medical advance was cynical. Not every doctor was indifferent. Some treatments did bring real relief to some patients. Some practices replaced even worse alternatives. Some patients who might once have been chained or brutalized were later treated with methods intended, however imperfectly, to reduce suffering. It is important to say that plainly, because the history becomes too simple if we reduce everything to evil intent. But recognizing nuance must not blunt the moral edge of what many patients experienced. Because the move from overt restraint to medical intervention did not erase fear. Sometimes it simply changed its shape. One of the clearest examples is the rise of sedatives and chemical control. Drugs that could calm, suppress, dull, immobilize, reduce agitation, encourage sleep, ease mania, mute psychosis, or simply quiet a ward that was too chaotic to manage otherwise. On paper, this sounds straightforward enough. A patient is in acute distress. A medicine is given to ease that distress. And sometimes, yes, that may genuinely have been the case. A sedative could bring rest to an exhausted mind. Could interrupt spiraling agitation. Could reduce terror, confusion, insomnia, or dangerous overactivation. Some patients may have welcomed such relief. Some may have felt, perhaps for the first time in days or weeks, a loosening of unbearable mental intensity. That is part of the truth. But there is another part. In large institutions, drugs could also serve the needs of the institution itself. A ward full of distressed, sleepless, shouting, pacing, frightened, or combative patients is hard to run. It exhausts staff. It disturbs order. It creates risk. It exposes how much suffering the system is failing to hold. Sedation can make all of that less visible. And once again, the question returns. Is the patient more comfortable, or merely less troublesome? This is not always easy to separate. And perhaps that is what makes chemical control so morally difficult. Because the same drug can be mercy in one context and domination in another. A sleeping patient may be finally resting, or simply rendered manageable. A slowed body may be escaping unbearable agitation, or losing the power to resist. A quiet ward may reflect good care, or suppress suffering. Inside institutions, where power was unequal and consent often blurred, this ambiguity could become deeply troubling. Patients might not fully understand what they were being given. They might experience side effects they could not properly describe. Heavy sedation could flatten thought, slow movement, thicken the tongue, blur the day into fog, and create a sense not of healing, but of disappearance. There is a peculiar horror in feeling your own mind become distant from you. Not because you have chosen rest, but because something has been administered that makes resistance harder, speech slower, feeling duller, thought less sharp. The body remains present, but agency begins to recede. And if a patient protested this, that protest itself could be folded back into the logic of illness. Of course they resist treatment, staff might say. They lack insight. They do not understand what is good for them. Again, the system closes in. A person can become trapped inside an interpretation of themselves that leaves little room for refusal. Then there is hydrotherapy, one of those historical treatments that sounds almost gentle when described abstractly. Water, baths, immersion, temperature. The language can suggest spas, soothing, therapeutic calm. But inside asylum history, hydrotherapy could be far more unsettling. Patients might be placed in prolonged baths for extended periods. Hot water or cold water might be used under the belief that the nervous system could be soothed, stimulated, calmed, or reset. Wet sheet packs and other water-based methods were used in some psychiatric settings as part of treatment regimens intended to reduce agitation or produce bodily effects thought to influence the mind. And once again, there is a divide between medical theory and lived experience. For some, warm baths may indeed have brought temporary comfort. Water can soothe. Warmth can relax a distressed body. Sensory containment can, in certain circumstances, calm overwhelming states. That is not impossible. But for others, prolonged immersion could feel punitive, humiliating, and deeply disturbing. Imagine being placed in a bath not because you seek comfort, but because authority has ordered it. Imagine not knowing how long you will remain there. Imagine attendants controlling the process, temperature, duration, and your ability to leave. Imagine already feeling exposed, observed, and powerless. Now your body is being handled as an object of treatment in a setting where privacy is minimal and trust is fragile. The experience could become one of submission rather than relief. Especially when the treatment was prolonged. Especially when cold water was involved. Especially when the patient interpreted the procedure not as care but as bodily punishment disguised as medicine. That duality is central to so much of psychiatric history. The same act can be described from above as therapeutic and experienced from below as coercive. A doctor writes, calming intervention. A patient feels, I was trapped, exposed, and made to endure something against my will. A report records compliance. A memory preserves terror. And history must hold both perspectives if it is to be honest. As the 20th century advanced, psychiatry entered an era of increasingly dramatic physical interventions. The hope driving many of these treatments was not necessarily sadistic. In fact, often it emerged from desperation. Psychiatric hospitals were full. Severe mental illness remained poorly understood. Doctors had limited effective options. Families wanted answers. Staff wanted wards to stabilize. The suffering of patients was often intense and prolonged. Into this atmosphere came a series of procedures that promised something medicine desperately wanted, a way to act. A way to do more than watch. A way to intervene physically in the hope of changing otherwise stubborn and devastating disorders. That desire for action can produce genuine innovation. But it can also produce grave harm when certainty outruns knowledge. One of the most feared treatments in public memory is electroconvulsive therapy, ECT. Few psychiatric procedures have acquired such a powerful cultural afterlife. Even people with little knowledge of psychiatric history often recognize the image. A patient, a machine, electricity, the body convulsing, the atmosphere of dread. And because ECT sits at the crossroads of real medical use and real historical fear, it has to be approached carefully. ECT was developed as a treatment for severe psychiatric conditions, especially major depression, some forms of psychosis, and catatonia. It emerged in a period when psychiatry was searching urgently for interventions that could shift profound illness. Over time, ECT became one of the most controversial procedures in mental health care. Part of that controversy comes from the difference between earlier and later practice. In earlier decades, the procedure could be far more crude than modern standards allow. Patients might receive treatment without the refinements, safeguards, anesthetic protocols, muscle relaxants, and regulatory frameworks associated with later practice. The bodily experience and surrounding atmosphere could therefore be much more frightening. The anticipation alone could be devastating. Being taken to a treatment room. Knowing what was coming, or half knowing. Hearing others talk about it in whispers or fear. Watching patients return dazed, confused, exhausted. Seeing memory disruption. Feeling that one's mind itself had become the site of violent intervention. Even when doctors believed sincerely that they were helping, the patient's experience could be one of extreme dread. And dread matters. Because a treatment does not occur only in the body. It occurs in the emotional world of the person receiving it. A patient terrified of ECT is not merely undergoing a neutral medical event. They are moving through anticipation, fear, helplessness, and afterward perhaps disorientation or memory disturbance that can feel deeply violating. To some patients, ECT brought improvement, particularly in conditions where severe depression or catatonia might otherwise have remained unbearable or life-threatening. That is part of the historical truth, and ignoring it would flatten the record unfairly. But another part of the truth is that many patients feared it intensely. Some experienced it as coercive. Some felt their consent was compromised or meaningless in the institutional setting. Some remembered the ritual around it more vividly than any supposed benefit. And in public imagination, ECT became a symbol not simply of psychiatric medicine, but of medicine's ability to overpower the mind in the name of cure. That symbolism did not come from nowhere. It came from histories of unequal power, variable standards, and genuine patient terror. Then there was insulin coma therapy, one of the most severe and astonishing psychiatric interventions of the 20th century. To modern listeners, it can sound almost surreal. Patients were given insulin in ways intended to induce hypoglycemic comas under the belief that this could alleviate certain severe mental illnesses, especially schizophrenia in the thinking of the time. The procedure was dangerous, complex, intensive, demanding. It required close management because the body was being pushed into a medically perilous state. Why would such a thing ever seem acceptable? Because psychiatry was operating in a landscape of desperation, limited success, and immense pressure to produce results. When an illness seemed otherwise resistant and devastating, dramatic intervention could begin to appear rational, even hopeful. That is one of the recurring patterns in medical history. The more helpless physicians feel before suffering, the more attractive radical procedures can become. But from the patient's side, insulin coma therapy could be bewildering and terrifying. Imagine being told, if told at all in terms you can understand, that a treatment involves pushing your body toward collapse in hopes that your mind might improve. Imagine the physical vulnerability, the exhaustion, the risks, the fear of not waking properly, the loss of control over your own consciousness. Imagine being one patient among many in a hospital where such procedures carry an aura of medical authority too strong to challenge. Even if staff acted with technical seriousness, the procedure itself occupied a frightening moral space. A person already mentally distressed is subjected to a treatment that deliberately overwhelms the body. And when outcomes were mixed, uncertain, or harmful, the human cost could be profound. To read about these interventions now is to feel the cold force of a medical era that often reached for the body when the mind remained mysterious. But perhaps the most chilling edge of this history appears when we reach psychosurgery. Few words produce such immediate unease. Surgery on the mind by altering the brain. Permanent intervention. Irreversible consequence. In British psychiatric history, psychosurgical procedures existed within a wider international context in which some clinicians believed that severe mental illness, agitation, obsession, depression, or uncontrollable behavior might be relieved by operating on the brain itself. The most infamous associated concept in public memory is the lobotomy, though practices, terminology, and prevalence varied by time and place. Here, the moral horror is sharpened by permanence. A sedative wears off. A restraint can be removed. A bath ends. Even ECT, however frightening, is episodic. But psychosurgery enters the body with a knife. Whatever is changed cannot simply be undone. And that means the threshold for ethical justification should be immense. Yet psychiatric history shows us that in moments of institutional pressure and medical confidence, thresholds can erode. A severely distressed, violent, self-harming, deeply depressed, or otherwise unmanageable patient could come to be seen not only as suffering, but as a candidate for radical intervention. And again we encounter the most unsettling question of all. Was the patient being treated for their own sake, or because the institution could not bear what they were like unaltered? Supporters of psychosurgery often argued that it relieved intolerable symptoms, reduced torment, and made life more bearable in otherwise hopeless cases. Critics pointed to blunt outcomes, flattened personality, cognitive and emotional damage, and the terrifying possibility that the very essence of a person was being altered in the name of manageability. From the patient's perspective, and from the perspective of later generations, the fear is obvious. What if the treatment removes not the illness, but the person? What if what medicine calls improvement is merely a reduction of intensity, initiative, resistance, spontaneity, emotional range, or human complexity? What if the success of the procedure is that the patient is now easier to live with, easier to supervise, easier to feed, dress, and contain? This is the abyss into which the history of psychosurgery opens. Not every physician who supported such methods intended harm. Many believed they were relieving desperate suffering. But intention is not enough. Because once medicine begins valuing quietness, tractability, and reduced disturbance as outcomes in themselves, the risk becomes enormous. The risk that what is being cured is not suffering, but inconvenience. And that word, inconvenience, may sound too small for such a brutal history. But institutions are often shaped by exactly that sort of pressure. Too many patients. Too little staff. Too much noise. Too much unpredictability. Too much violence. Too much grief. Too much need. Under those conditions, treatments that promise order can become irresistibly attractive. Not because they are always malicious, but because they solve problems the institution feels immediately. A heavily sedated patient causes fewer disruptions. A restrained patient stops pacing. A secluded patient is no longer in the communal ward. A surgically blunted patient may become easier to supervise. This does not prove that every intervention was undertaken cynically. But it does force us to confront how easily therapeutic language can serve administrative need. And once that happens, the moral ground shifts. The patient is no longer only a person to be healed. They become a body to be regulated. A nervous system to be modified. A behavior pattern to be suppressed. A risk to be managed. A burden to be reduced. This is why the history of terrifying treatments cannot be told only as a history of bizarre medical ideas. It is also a history of power. Who had the authority to decide what counted as illness? Who had the authority to impose treatment? Who controlled the records? Who defined success? Who could refuse? Who would be believed if they said a treatment had harmed them? Inside the asylum, these questions rarely had equal answers. Doctors had authority. Institutions had authority. Families sometimes had authority. The state had authority. The patient, especially the poor patient, often had the least. And once a person was labeled mentally ill, their protests could be dangerously easy to dismiss. Fear of treatment could be interpreted as irrationality. Anger at coercion could be interpreted as instability. Refusal could be interpreted as lack of insight. Memory of mistreatment could be discounted as delusion. This made psychiatric patients uniquely vulnerable. Not only because painful or frightening things could be done to them, but because the very framework of the institution made it harder for them to prove that those things had been wrong. That is one reason old psychiatric hospitals remain so haunting in cultural memory. Not merely because suffering happened there, but because suffering happened under authority difficult to challenge. A prison at least declares itself as a place of confinement. A hospital claims to heal. When healing and coercion become entangled, the result can be psychologically devastating. Because the person is told that what frightens them is for their own good. That what hurts is medicine. That what takes away their power is care. Some patients undoubtedly did improve under certain treatments. Some found genuine relief. Some procedures that were once feared later became more regulated, more selective, more evidence-based, or less crudely administered. That historical evolution matters. But so does memory. And memory, especially collective memory, has preserved something profound about asylum treatment. The sense that the patient's body was often where institutional desperation, medical ambition, and social control all met. In the treatment room, abstract ideas became physical. Theories entered flesh. Power touched the skin. The mind, invisible and suffering, was approached through straps, chemicals, water, electricity, needles, scalpels, schedules, commands, and charts. And the patient, lying there or being led there or dragged there in fear, had to trust a system that many had already learned not to trust. Imagine the atmosphere on a ward where patients know that certain procedures await those judged ill enough, difficult enough, or unwell enough. The rumors. The anticipatory terror. The glance toward the treatment room door. The stories exchanged in whispers. The fear not only of pain, but of transformation. Of returning different. Of returning dazed. Of not returning fully yourself. There is a peculiar loneliness in psychiatric fear. If you are terrified of a treatment, but everyone around you insists it is necessary, your terror itself can isolate you. You begin to doubt your own judgment. Or cling to it more desperately. Either way, you are trapped in a world where the meaning of what happens to you is controlled by others. That may be the most enduring emotional truth of all. Many asylum treatments were frightening not solely because of their physical effects, but because they took place inside a system where the patient's voice had so little power. And without voice, even care can feel like violation. So when we speak about the dark side of British asylums, we are not just speaking about old instruments, outdated therapies, or primitive medicine. We are speaking about a deeper moral fault line. The point at which treatment becomes indistinguishable from obedience. The point at which the improved patient is simply the more compliant patient. The point at which medicine, unable to cure fully, begins to reward stillness over truth, docility over distress, and silence over the difficult work of understanding. That is the nightmare hidden beneath the clinical language. Not that doctors tried to act, but that in acting, they could mistake suppression for healing. And once an institution begins making that mistake repeatedly, it changes the entire atmosphere of care. The patient learns that being less troublesome may matter more than being truly well. The ward learns that order is evidence of success. The public learns to trust the authority of medicine. And behind that trust, untold individual experiences disappear into the official record. No one section of asylum history captures this more starkly than the world of feared treatment. Because here, the violence was often intimate. Not always spectacular. Not always shouted. Often clinical. Measured. Charted. Approved. That is what makes it so chilling. It was suffering administered through systems that believed themselves rational. And in the next part, we move from treatment rooms to one of the most devastating realities of institutional life. Death inside the asylum. Because behind the statistics of overcrowding, disease, neglect, and long-term confinement were countless endings, some expected, some preventable, some barely mourned outside the walls. And to understand the full darkness of British asylums, we have to ask not only how people lived there, but how so many died there too.